In Dragon Ball Z, the villain Cell was the creation of Dr. Gero, who was completed by his supercomputer. Born in the future timeline after Trunks had defeated the androids, Cell was a biological android whose purpose was to absorb Android 17 and 18 to attain his perfection. Cell would eventually travel to the past of our main timeline and attain this perfection, making him the greatest threat the Z fighters had ever faced. The brilliance of Cell's design and what truly made him so terrifying was that he was composed of cells from the mightiest Dragon Ball heroes and villains we had seen up until that point. He had Goku cells as well as those of Vegeta, Piccolo, and Frieza, all of which granted their techniques such as the Kamehameha and unique abilities like regeneration. However, this also resulted in Cell taking on personality traits from those he was comprised of, which in many ways led to his eventual downfall. However, while most of his genetic donators have been extensively fleshed out as characters, one of them only briefly appeared to us. This individual in question was Frieza's father, King Cold, and I've often wondered what effects Cold had on Cell, and if any of what we saw from him was directly related to his inclusion in Cell's genetic makeup. King Cold has always been one of my favorite minor villains from Dragon Ball Z. However, his time in the franchise was very brief, as he arrived, was killed by Trunks, and vanished from the story. As a result of this, Cold seems like a mostly unknown commodity, and what his abilities are and much of his backstory remains a mystery. As a result, it's difficult to determine what impact he may have had on the personality and abilities of Cell. But from what we do have of Cold, we can draw some comparisons. Now, as we saw from King Cold's time in the series, he appeared to be far more pragmatic than Frieza. He brought his son back from the brink of death and made him stronger, while most of Dragon Ball villains would just discard their comrades. Cold was also the one to suggest that they blow up the Earth from space, rather than going to the surface and getting involved in a battle. And of course, Cold had no problem fighting alongside Frieza, potentially ganging up on Goku, while most Dragon Ball villains and heroes tend to go with the one-on-one approach. And when we look at Cell, he's also pragmatic. He seeks out ways to attain greater power under his enemies' noses, enacts plans such as traveling through time to achieve his goals, and he's always looking for an edge against his opponents, much like King Cold did with Trunks' sword. However, Piccolo is also a pragmatic character, so it's possible that Cell could have inherited his cerebral nature from Piccolo instead. King Cold also took pride in his clan and viewed what Goku had done to Frieza as a slight against his pride and power. After all, his son was proclaimed the Emperor of the Universe by many, and Cold clearly held a similar position of power himself. Cell additionally viewed himself as the perfect life form and ultimate power in the universe, and sought to destroy the Earth when he was overpowered and embarrassed by Gohan. However, many of these traits can also be attributed to Vegeta, who also tried to destroy the Earth when Goku embarrassed him in their first fight. And of course Frieza, who is an arrogant, prideful conqueror and dictator of worlds. But let's venture away from personality and compare physiology instead. Both Cell and King Cold are physically imposing, towering over most of the other characters in the series. Cell can also achieve multiple transformations through absorbing the androids, which increase his power dramatically. And while we never saw King Cold transform in canon, his son Frieza is capable of doing this, and Vegeta referred to his species as being able to do it as well. So it could be a trait that came from their species. Most interestingly, perhaps, is Perfect Cell's ability to asexually reproduce the Cell Juniors, who inherit Cell's abilities and are born incredibly powerful. This could be related to King Cold because in a Toriyama interview, he stated that Frieza was born from his father alone and inherited his mutant traits. And as we know, Frieza was also born with an incredible power that allowed him to dominate the universe for decades. Thus, it's entirely possible that Frieza was born using this method, and Cell inherited this ability from King Cold. However, with Cell being intended to be the perfect life form, asexual reproduction may have been part of his design from the beginning. So with all of this being said, it is rather difficult to determine what parts of Cell come down to his programming, the inclusion of other fighters, and what could have come from King Cold. This is mostly due to how little we got to see of Cold. However, it's still a very fascinating topic to me, and one I've often wondered about in my years rewatching Dragon Ball Z and rereading the manga. Now, will we ever receive a definitive answer to this question? That's something I'm unsure of, but it would certainly be an interesting question for Toriyama to give his perspective on in the future. Make sure to subscribe to this channel and enable notifications so you could see all of my content right away when it comes out.
Yeah, and you better subscribe, enable those damn notifications.